School leader. Hey, before we get started into this week's lesson, I just want to say a big thank you. Thank you so much. This past couple of weeks, I think I surpassed the 400 subscribers on YouTube. And that just really is humbling. It really amazes me because I started this several years ago with just the thought of doing this for my few adult Sunday school teachers that I have. So thank you guys for watching and commenting and asking about my wife and all that stuff. So anyway, I appreciate you guys. All right. Well, you know, every one of us has been through some kind of crisis, whether that's the death of a loved one, the loss of a job, a bad diagnosis, whatever that is. So we think about, to prepare for that, what's our number one survival tip to prepare for that crisis? You know, that might be a good question to start off the class with. You know, do you stockpile food? Do you stockpile toilet paper for the next wave of coronavirus, the spike? All those things. What do we do? So anyway, one crisis that our nation had, and most of the world was on the edge of their seat. It's just 9 months after the first landing and walking on the moon. This started April 11th, 1970. Apollo 13 blasted off from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, but just 2 days into the mission, a routine stir of an oxygen tank, it ignited some damaged wire insulation inside of it and caused an explosion that vented the contents of both service modules, the oxygen tanks of those service modules, into space. Emptied out the oxygen tanks. So here they are, they're in space, they have very limited oxygen, they're in a crisis. What do? Well, those of you history buffs or folks who are old like me might remember that just 3 years before that, a flash fire swept through Apollo 1, that command module, when it was during a launch rehearsal test, and all 3 crew members perished. So NASA certainly didn't want this to be another black mark on their space program. So the folks on the ground in the Kennedy Space Center, they're calculating and with their slide rules and all that. And the men in space had to adjust, right? They had to make some sacrifices of comfort in order to get back safely. And of course they did. They returned to Earth back safely on April 17th, 6 days after they left and 4 days after the explosion. So like I said, most of us either remember the event or they've seen that 1994 movie with Tom Hanks and Kevin Bacon. And some lessons that are learned from that event is, one, stay calm, right? You stay calm in the event of a crisis. Number 2 is that relief usually doesn't come immediately. And number 3, you got to keep that communication open with someone who may not be seen, but they know what they're doing, to give some instructions on the safe return and how to get out of that crisis. So we're going to see how that parallels here with Joseph's story. Of course, that's who we've been looking at for several weeks, isn't it? He's faced one crisis after another. We've seen him sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused of sexual harassment by his boss's wife, forgotten in prison, all these things. And so that brings us up to, we're continuing in that unit, how to avoid life's pitfalls. This is the 4th lesson, entitled The Pitfall of Hard Times. And we'll be looking at several passages in Genesis 41, so go ahead and be finding that passage. The point of this lesson is, trust God to see you through any crisis. Well, when we left off last week, Joseph had interpreted the dreams for the baker and the cupbearer while they were in prison. And what Joseph said came to pass. The cupbearer was restored to his position with Pharaoh, but the baker was executed, just as Joseph said. And Joseph, all he asked the cupbearer to do is, remember me when you get out of here, so I can get out of here too. Mention me to Pharaoh. Get me out of prison. But at the very end of chapter 40, we see that the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. That brings us to chapter 41. So Pharaoh has a couple of dreams back to back one night about cows and corn. So you had these 7 fat cows, and they were eaten by 7 emaciated cows. He woke up and had another dream. 7 full heads of grain swallowed by 7 withered heads of grain. And it really bothered him because the dreams were different, but they were still similar. So the next morning, Pharaoh called all of his magicians and wise men together to interpret his dream, and no one could do it. And so this was an aha moment for the cupbearer. Oh yeah, I remember this guy in prison, he was able to interpret dreams back when I was in custody. And the baker and I had these dreams. And this Hebrew slave, he interpreted those dreams. So what did Pharaoh do? He sent for Joseph. What did Joseph do? He shaved, changed his clothes, got all dolled up because he's going before the head guy. He's going before Pharaoh. Now we can look back in Genesis 37, verse 2, that Joseph was 17 years of age when he was sold into slavery. We're going to see in a little bit that he was 30 years old when he came before Pharaoh. So he spent 13 years in captivity as a prisoner, as a slave. So there's these three cycles. You know, it was as good as it gets. And then he hits rock bottom, and he's faithful, and he rises back. And he's a favored son. He's sold. He's the head of Potiphar's house. He's falsely accused and thrown in prison. He's the servant to the captain of the guard, and hoping to get out of there. And then he's forgotten back in prison. So it's this up and down cycle, but that cycle's almost ready to end. Now, as we look at Genesis 41, verses 28 through 32, that's our first section of verses this week. And just in a moment, Joseph went from being a forgotten man in prison to standing before Pharaoh. Now, notice that Joseph acknowledged that God was the one who was going to supply the meaning of Pharaoh's dreams. He didn't attempt to grab the credit for himself. So under God's direction, Joseph showed that these dreams pointed to 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph identified a couple of challenges for Pharaoh. The first challenge was, how do we make the best use of the time of prosperity that's right before us? And the second was to find a way to avoid the destruction of Pharaoh's people when the famine came. Here's a lesson we should learn. When we have an abundance of something, that doesn't necessarily mean it's ours to splurge on, is it? Okay, they had that abundance of crops for 7 years. Had this dream not happened, had this interpretation not happened, I'm sure they would have eaten all that up and been subject to the famine 7 years later. So when we get that bonus check or that unexpected windfall of whatever money comes our way that we weren't intending on coming our way, any assets or even relationships, it could represent God preparing you for what lies ahead. And you can see how this goes against the mindset of so many people in today's world, including Christians. You know, the normal thought is anything that comes my way, any windfall I get today is for my immediate pleasure. And as a result, you might not have anything in reserve. There's maybe no margin in your finances. Back in the year 2001, I was in my first ministry job in Liberal, Kansas, and it was a very stressful year for our pastor. His younger son was graduating from high school. His daughter was getting married that year. His wife was diagnosed with breast cancer, and he had some heart issues and had heart bypass surgery. All that happened in that calendar year. A lot of extra duties, of course, fell on me. Now, someone in our congregation, I guess, felt led to give us some money for all that extra work. So we received this anonymous $5,000 windfall. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind is, wow, we can take a great vacation for a change. But we didn't do that because we are pretty financially responsible people. Got to put that aside. Well, what happened? We had to replace the radiator in our car. All these other expenses came along. And so that was one way that God, I believe, was providing in advance for some things that were going to come in the future. But here's the thing. God provided, but it was up to us whether we were going to waste it or not. Now, in the next several verses that's not in our lesson text this week, Joseph managed out a survival plan for the next 14 years. He offered a strategy to prevent starvation and a plan to shield Egypt's prosperity from ruin by setting aside 20% of the abundant harvest each year and then empowering a capable leadership team and building enough suitable storage facilities with appropriate safeguards. This is the plan Joseph had. He had this solid plan to feed the people for the 7 years to come. Well, so in the midst of adversity, and this really wasn't even his problem. He was just a slave down in this land. But he rose to the occasion with God's help. Because here's what he did the whole time. Whenever he was sold into slavery, he served wherever he was faithfully. When he was betrayed, he bounced back. When he was humbled, he worked his way up. And in this moment here before Pharaoh, he put his God-given skills and experience to work. Now, we've all sat in classes, we've all sat in trainings where we've thought, I am never going to need this. Why am I having to learn this? Well, sometimes we're right, but other times it comes in useful in later years. Here's the thing, God never gives us anything we don't need. You know, it's true with what we call blessings, like that $5,000, as well as some of those painful situations in our life. And I'd mentioned this before about the phrase that God never wastes a hurt. Of course, the first part of Joseph's plan was to find an intelligent and wise person capable of carrying it out. And this new guy here, this guy they'd never seen before, this Hebrew slave straight from prison, it looked like he just had a bath and a haircut. You know, he got right to the heart of the matter. Pharaoh, if we're going to survive this, we're going to need a leader. Now, the primary quality about Joseph that Pharaoh mentioned was his dependence on God. Now, he ignored the fact that Joseph had a questionable past. I'm sure it was colored possibly by rumors about what had happened with Pharaoh's wife. You know, he had this long prison term. Pharaoh could see that God's Spirit was in Joseph. And this made Joseph a very wise young man. So Pharaoh promoted Joseph to be the prime minister of Egypt. We can believe that our past has destroyed any hope of a prosperous future, but when we give ourselves to God, we ask for His help, when we remain faithful, no past is too terrible or dark for Him to overcome. Now, in Genesis chapter 41, verses 47 through 49, we have Joseph here, the slave, boldly giving Pharaoh this plan of action. And Pharaoh wisely saw that Joseph was the one that should carry out this plan. So Joseph was given complete authority over the nation of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. Now, does that sound familiar? That's kind of been his story so far. He was second in command at Potiphar's house. Potiphar entrusted everything to him. Didn't worry about a thing. In prison, same thing. He was kind of the trustee of the prison. He was kind of the second in command. And now he's in second in command all over Egypt. He was given Pharaoh's own signet ring and this chain of gold. He also got a wife in the deal as well. And Joseph could have said, well, finally, I'm out of prison, the good life. It's a chance to sit back and relax. But he didn't do that. Instead, Joseph left the comfort of the palace and got to work. See, he wasted no time. He inspected the entire land of Egypt. He wanted to understand every resource he had at his disposal to accomplish the great task in front of him. Sam Walton, of course, the founder of Walmart, was known to say, never lead from your chair. What do you think that means? That means don't sit in your ivory tower and bark out commands. It means be an example. Lead by doing, okay? Be a doer. Lead by example. We get down to verses 50 through 54, and we see Joseph had a couple of sons, and he named them after his brothers, Manasseh and Ephraim. The years of abundance came to an end. Famine followed. Famine followed in all the lands around them as well, but in Egypt there was enough food. And why was that? Because this humble Hebrew slave was wise. He was used by God to prepare for this awful event. Now, in God's redemptive plan, Joseph endured some very hard times, yet the Lord did not expect him to overcome those hard times in his own strength. And today, when we cooperate with God in His work, He gives us insight, He gives us stamina sufficient for the situation. When following God presents us with hard times, we can overcome them, knowing that He has a plan to see us through any crisis. Now, here's the thing. We've all been impacted by this economic downturn that was caused by the COVID pandemic. You know, it could be as minor as just paying a little bit more for gas, or maybe as major as losing a job, losing your house. Here's the thing. God is bigger than the economy, bigger than world markets, bigger than COVID. Now, in this lesson, we saw how God prepared and led Joseph in advance of difficult times. While our situation is different than Joseph's, the Bible offers some principles in this story to help us overcome when we face hard times on our own. So here's some things we can do to both prepare ourselves for crisis and when we're facing it, to get through it. First thing is to center your mind on God. Isaiah 26:3 says, "You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you." When your mind is steadfast, when it's focused, when it's concentrated on God, God will bring peace to your mind and help you get through that situation. Also, the old hymn, count your blessings. Count your blessings and give thanks. 1 Thessalonians 5:16 through 18 says, "Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." You know, it's difficult when you're in the bad times to give thanks for those bad times. But we can give thanks in the good times. We can look for good, count our blessings. Also, third thing is continue your work. You know, being faithful with whatever it is God's entrusted you with, whatever God's blessed you with, talent-wise or whatever. Joseph continued to be faithful, even when he was in prison, even when he was a slave. You know people like this, they have a crisis in their life and they tend to fall away from the church. The last thing we can do is consider your future. Romans 8:18 says, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." The terrible things that we go through in this life, and I'm not trying to diminish those or make light of those, but when you compare that to heaven, when you compare that to the glory that awaits us, it's minuscule. It's not non-comparable, okay? Well, that's our lesson for this week. We have another lesson or two left in Joseph's life, so we'll see what happens with that next week. Thank you so much, guys, for watching. Don't forget, pray for and with your class. Thank you again.